presentation with 10 minutes of questions. But out of that, what I'd like to do is turn this into the nascent form of Dumbarton women history. And what I'd like to do, of course, is crowdsource it, be the Dumbarton Wikipedia. And thanks to Jim Quinn, who got this ball rolling, he just threw out a list and we can all add to it, and I'll cycle because that's what I want to get out of this. I want us to be writing her story. I am not your church historian as much as I would like to be. We need all to be the church historians. So let's talk about who influenced us. Let's go back to Numbers. Let's go back to Moses. So as we start looking at the women who have influenced Dumbarton, we obviously have to go back to our biblical heritage. So I looked at the daughters of Zelophehad. Their father died with no sons, and so they were going to inherit no property. So these 5 daughters went to Moses and said, "We demand land just like all the other sons." And so Moses said, "Yeah, let me talk to God about this." And God said, "Yeah, they're right." So in Numbers, it lists the daughters, and I feel like say their names is kind of going to be the repeating theme of this. So Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Miklah, Tirzah went before all of these men and pleaded their case, just like Martha does in a court of law. Then, of course, if we start looking at the Christian heritage of women, we know obviously Jesus was born of a woman, and there's been all of these wonderful written histories about Mary's, and of course, Mary Magdalene. You heard me talk about how much I loved the musical, and now we have people who've gone to see it. So it will not take no for an answer. So we've discussed Mary Magdalene for 2,000 years, right? And in this musical, if you get to see it at the Olney, you'll see a modern day take on what would a 16-year-old Mary Magdalene be like. And there's just charming, charming jokes that come left and right. But we do know that Mary Magdalene, or the Magdalene, was not a prostitute. She was not a woman of ill repute. She supported Jesus and his disciples. She was one of the first to see the risen Jesus. She was the first to bring the good news while the men were cowering in their hiding place. So again, we have very strong women. And now we're going to jump all the way to Susanna Wesley, the mother of John and Charles Wesley. So we could go, of course, through a lot of Christian history. Why did Mary Magdalene get confused with a prostitute? Well, obviously, it was a man's rewriting of history in like 600. But we can start tracing a very strong line of women who have been on the edges of Christianity for thousands of years. Now, Charles and John Wesley grew up in England. Their mother, Susanna, was a strong influence on their lives. She taught them at the kitchen table. She led prayer services at the Christian table. It was her structured approach to learning and living that gave John the method. So the UMW has a great videos that you can see. So here we have the mother of Methodism.
Susanna Wesley is the mother of one of church history's greatest dynamic duos. John and Charles are their mother's sons. She is the person who was responsible for their education and spiritual formation.
United Methodist historians say the fathers of the Methodist movement owe much of their success to their mother and the foundation built in their childhood home.
She had a spreadsheet before there were spreadsheets. She had an incredible organizational schedule for their dressing and changing clothes.
Born in 1669, Susanna Wesley was the youngest of 25. At age 19, she married Church of England pastor Samuel Wesley and bore 19 children. Managing a
How
home
many
took great
children?
planning, but she made time to nurture each child.
She would mark out at least an hour, and so it might well be that Tuesday at 3 was a time that was exclusively devoted to John, let's say. Now, it wasn't mean she ignored him the rest of the week, but it meant that was their time to sit down and be together. And she did that with all of her children.
How many children? She did it with all her children. So again, we're looking at what formed us as Methodists. Now, I'm going to obviously give you this slideshow. It has all the links to these movies. These are really well done. Thank you, UM conference.
You're a person of good work.
Susanna Wesley.
Thank you for the, I forgot the book and I'll loan it out to you, but Donna L. Fowler Marchant, who's now doing kind of circuit writing outside of London, wrote a book about some of the more important preachers. Now, United Methodists had preachers, they had pastors, and they had exhorters. So an exhorter, of course, would harangue you for maybe up to 2 hours after the pastor had given you the sermon. And so you had to be licensed to do this. And so the haranguers were often women. So this is an interview. So I bought the book and then I found the video.
Geographical areas.
Mothers in
I'm
Israel.
in a couple of groups on Facebook. One is for United Methodist clergy mothers, and one is for United Methodist clergy women, regardless of whether they have children or not. And we have, I think, the modern equivalent in some ways of those communities, because we offer our support to each other. We answer each other's questions and sometimes really challenge each other and push each.
So this video is over an hour long, but it's basically her book. She's from North Carolina, I believe, and these are the women that she is talking about that were very influential in developing Methodism. So again, I'll bring the book next Sunday. You're welcome to borrow it, although I think it's only $16 on Amazon. And I'm sure Reverend Fowler would appreciate it. So what I want to do is I could spend hours talking about all of these women. Obviously, that's what we need to do. But I'm just going to give you highlights today. So here's one of my favorite women. Have you heard of Dorothy Ripley? She was the first woman to speak at the US Capitol. She went to Thomas Jefferson's office and shook her finger in Thomas Jefferson's face for having slaves. She rode on her own like Francis Asbury. Francis Asbury blessed her. She did circuit ridings. She preached to the Oneida. She had to, of course, fundraise. She was not a sanctioned minister to any conference. There wasn't really a conference, or to any church. This is early on, 1806. So she comes from England. She travels down into the southern plantations. She witnesses slavery. She wants to preach to the slaves, enslaved people, not the slave owners. She is not that popular with the slave owners, as you can imagine, but she gets support from all kinds of people, mostly Quakers, because this is more in the Quaker tradition that people are, what's this woman doing? This is uncomfortable for me. But people house her. She has a long ministry. She writes 5 books, publishes them herself, because this is how she is crowdsourcing her ministry. So it's not just Dorothy Ripley who is like, oh my gosh. We also have Harriet Livermore, who was the second woman to address Congress. Yes, Methodist woman. Harriet Livermore addressed Congress 5 times. She was the hot ticket to get in 1827. The Foxalls went. She was friends of the church. She never came to the church, but she was big. So she was known sometimes as the most remarkable woman in the United States. But that's what they said about Dorothy Ripley first. So Harriet Livermore, Dorothy Ripley. Dorothy was from England, and Harriet was the daughter of a former congressman. So she was from the colonies, from the North, of course. So women are starting to get this blessing. They're starting to work as preachers, as exhorters. But then 1940, the Methodists are saying, this is a little too uncomfortable for us, and say they cannot act outside the sphere of their sex. So I'm going to jump ahead to we have the Civil War, and we're all about the Civil War upstairs today. There's a fabulous book here, 2020, brand new, The Women's Fight, that really breaks down all the different ways that women were fighting in the Civil War, Northern, Southern, white, Black, enslaved, educated, non-educated. But the missionary movement is getting its footing at this time. And so this is another apportionments paid video available on the website. What's the title? The League of Extraordinary Methodist Women. It's a cartoon.
In 1869, Methodist missionaries and their wives had returned home from India. While there, missionary wives had been stunned to learn that it was deemed inappropriate for the native women to be seen by a male doctor. At the time, males dominated the medical profession. When a group of 8 Methodist Episcopal women heard this
is awkward.
They were in disbelief.
No phones.
And knew they had to do something about it. On a dark and stormy night, they gathered to figure out what to do. It was decided they would send a woman doctor to India. With faith and determination, they wrote to women all across the United States, informing them of their plan and asking for their assistance. In a short amount of time, they had raised enough money to send the first female.
That was 1869 when they first came back. So right after that.
These women sent out the first female missionaries. Today, United Methodist women continue their legacy by supporting over 300 mission projects all around the world.
Extraordinary women. I think this was a good start for the UMW. I thought they would have more extraordinary women. This is another UMW video about another mission project.
At the turn of the 20th century, steamships arrived at the rate of 3 a day in New York, teeming with immigrants eager for a new start. Those aboard faced huge challenges. They were often penniless, spoke no English, and became targets for those who would steal their luggage or exploit them. Yet many must have been relieved when they saw the faces of Methodists there to welcome the stranger.
Greeting people on the dock was one of the ways that the women of the church were able to receive people and connect them to a place of safety.
One woman who changed history was Methodist Alma Matthews. She devoted nearly 40 years to the daily task of meeting the boats and offering women, some traveling with children, free lodging at the immigrant girls' home.
There were, in that day, just as there are today, plenty of dangers for young women traveling by themselves.
Despite language barriers or concern for her own safety, Matthews would approach women coming off the ships and offer assistance.
Some of them were coming to meet family. Some of them were coming without knowing what the situation was that they would face. She greeted them at the harbor. She collected food. She collected clothing. We have records of her reports where she would say distributed this many pounds of clothing, wrote this many telegrams, wrote this many letters, because she was trying to connect, especially young girls, to family who were expected to receive them.
Alma's parents were doing this work for years before Ellis Island opened in 1892. They were appointed by the Women's Home Missionary Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church, a precursor to United Methodist Women. Alma and church members.
Okay. So again, this is such fabulous stuff. So we started at Dumbarton, of course, the Missionary Society. And this is from the Washington Post. So 1914, the Dumbarton Missionary Society gets started. I did go to look at our records in the Kiplinger Library on Thursday, and I did find these sweet handwritten minutes where the women met monthly in members' homes, sometimes at the parsonage. They collected money. But I think I love everyone ends with, and then we broke for refreshments and a good time was had by all. So we had also the Young Women's Society. And again, that is a picture from our records at the Kiplinger Library. And they went by Robert's Rules of Orders. They elected people. They elected women as officers. The men had their own missionary society as well. So that was a man's thing that started earlier. Now, we've talked briefly about the Women's Christian Temperance Union. This is Frances Willard, another great Methodist woman, and another apportionments paid movie.
Frances Willard is a person who brought the involvement of women in and through the Methodist Church very much into the foreground.
Church historians have called this red-headed reformer the most widely known and loved Methodist woman since Susanna Wesley. In the late 1800s, Frances Willard was a professor and dean of women at a time few females went to college. But she may be best remembered for her 19 years as president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in the U.S., which sought to ban the sale of alcohol.
Oh, the bluest thing of all is coming down the road, floating around old Dixon below.
Willard saw men as the victims of the temptation of liquor, but believed the ultimate victims were women and children.
They weren't concerned about abstinence from alcohol for abstinence sake. They saw that the church had a message to proclaim to people that mothers and women needed to speak up about because of how social conditions in that time were really ruining people's lives. We remember Frances Willard only as a great temperance worker, would be remembered for a saying like, lips that touch liquor will never touch mine. I think that really minimizes the extent of what Frances Willard and other women like her in that period of time were concerned about.
The Temperance Union became the largest women's organization in the U.S. 150,000 members strong, the association moved beyond prohibition to argue for an 8-hour workday, raise the age of consent for girls, and secure the right of women to vote. In the Methodist Church, Willard also pushed the envelope.
She was actually originally elected to General Conference before women could be elected. They had made plans to see if General Conference would seat them.
Willard didn't get to challenge General Conference that year. She was called home to care for her mother. Never married, she traveled extensively in her work.
She had a small desk. We think of a laptop computer nowadays. She had like the original laptop. When the train would get to a train station, if she needed to send off a telegram, she would jump off the train, quickly give the paper to the telegraph operator, and then get back on and continue on to her next destination.
Willard,
So let's do a quick recap. Can you give me a name of a woman who influenced Dumbarton? I know. So we just talked about Frances Willard. Do you remember Dorothy Ripley, Harriet Livermore? You can go back to Mary Magdalene, right? So I know I am dumping a ton of women on you, but there's more. So we're not, again, not going to finish the 10-minute video here. My apologies. But we start again in this time period after the Civil War because of two different changes. Of course, many of the men and women in the United States at that time period were suffering from PTSD. There was a general depression. There was an economic depression, a moral depression, a psychological depression. Alcohol was now much easier to get. Transportation had improved. So, and this was one of the outcomes of the Civil War, is people were drinking more. It is not a coincidence. There is a factor that causes this horrible, horrible decline in society. And so again, the temperance movement was not just about, you know, creepy, smelly breath or anything like that. This was a significant problem in the United States socially. The men were spending a lot of money on alcohol. It was widely available. Bars and saloons were widely available. Bars and saloons, of course, were men only. And so what you have, of course, is the separation of men from their families in the evening hours. So yes, there were crusades where women like us would go kneel in a bar and pray for the men's souls. And that kind of creeped out bar owners. And so they shut down bars and saloons. Then, of course, for those of you that know Chautauqua, and I know some of you are very familiar with it. Who established Chautauqua, ladies and gentlemen? Yep, so this is a Methodist assembly, and they established Chautauqua, they established WCTU there. Again, you can go to the Washington Post, get yourself a Washington, D.C. library card. You can read all these wonderful articles about us. And so here we hosted the spring quarterly meeting of the WCTU for the district. I wrote to the Frances Willard House in Chicago and asked if they had any records if she had visited Dumbarton. And they said, no, she was in the area. And so it makes sense. I mean, she was a big name, right? So she would have drawn thousands of people. So more likely she was at the DAR rather than our sanctuary. But we definitely had one of the early WCTU unions. And so I sent some of our records to the Frances Willard House. Just thought you'd want to know. There was a temperance class for children, and it was one of the books I didn't get to at the library on Thursday, the Kiplinger Library, but they would sign in the pledge book. They had the WCTU pledge book, and they had children. So repeat after me. I promise, God helping me, never to buy, sell, or drink, or give alcoholic beverages while I live. From all tobacco, I'll abstain, and never take God's name in vain. You like the rhyming, I can tell. All right, so we have lots of temperance work. Now, on Wednesday, after I met with Mitty, we walked over to the Ukrainian embassy. And I thanked the Episcopalian minister, deacon, who was standing there. And I told him what I was doing. And he said, oh, you got to include the booths in your Dumbarton history window, because he was a Methodist pastor when he started. So theologically, the Salvation Army is based on Methodist theology. But of course, the militaristic structure is all Salvation Army. So here's his wife, Catherine Booth, Army mother. And here's his daughter, Evangeline Booth, who lived to be 90 years old and drove hospital trucks in World War I. Oh, this is kind of jumps out of it. All right, so those of you who've been to Seneca Falls, where did it take place? In Seneca, New York. What building? The Methodist Chapel, the Wesleyan Chapel. So Seneca Falls, because Elizabeth Cady Stanton lived there. So anyway, there it is. You can go see it today. Oh, so now I've jumped to us. So trying to do is kind of chronologically. I went through Women of the Windows. Now, you know that, of course, I have to talk about the windows all through 2022, and then I probably won't talk about them in 2023. But let's just look at the women who are in the windows. So we have all sorts of great information. And Anna Birch, Carolyn Wheatley. And I love this idea. What if I just said, forget that Frances Wheatley is there. Let's say this window is actually dedicated to Carolyn Wheatley and her husband. So here we have Elizabeth Daw and her husband. And Alan, aren't these terrible? Alan, are you still here? Oh, these are terrible pictures. Nobody moved the light guard, the glass globe in front of the women's names, which is why the women's names are kind of mushy. So again, you can get all this information for only $20 by buying the book. Alcinda, Anna Lipscomb, Dixon. This is such a hilarious story, right? John Dixon has two wives, one named Anne, one named Anna. Anne gets on the window with John. Anna gets her own window downstairs, but they're all buried together at Oak Grove. John, his two wives. It's a crowded place. Catherine Dixon, again, lived to 67, never married. Wonder what happened there. I got nothing. I looked for her. Okay, so I told you when I did the marriage slides, I was waiting for the big society wedding, the one that made the front pages, and never found it. However, I knew that Margaret Eads was going to be my girl. So she dedicated the window to her father. What's up with that? She, the daughter, not the wife. So her mother had died when she was 5, I guess, and she grew up to never married, and Maddie Brown, blah, 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 Priscilla Brown. Let's get to all these wonderful women. So finally, I got to the Peabody Room at the Georgetown Library, talked to the historian there, who was very sweet, and he handed me the Margaret Eads file. I was a little nervous. It's very thin. It has 2 little paragraphs, but it was enough to get me started. So Margaret Eads, she inherits her father, William Eads, the miller's fortune with her brother. Her brother dies intestate, 79. She gets it all. She becomes the society hostess with the mostest. So as you're reading through all of these articles, here she is in 1892, coming back from her long absence abroad. It describes what she's wearing. Here's Margaret Eads, 1896, giving one of her regular teas. She gives her regular Christmas. Her usual New Year's afternoon. She also went to the World's Fair. She gave dinner parties with named baronesses. So our connection, of course, with Margaret Eads is actually pretty tenuous. She was not a member in 1898. She was kind of a St. John's girl. Her house was on K Street, so she was more of an Episcopalian, which goes with my joke. What's the difference between a Methodist and Episcopalian? Your income. If you're too rich to be a Methodist, you become an Episcopalian. So that's what happens. Actually, at her funeral, she was buried by a Methodist and an by the Dumbarton Methodist pastor and her Episcopalian rector. All right, so she has $100,000 in 1906. And she leaves it for this house that you see there. It took $45,000 to build, and then she left a board, and on the board was Isaac Birch from this church. And this house was supposed to hold indigent widows. So it started going bankrupt. The board did not do a very good job. And after 50 years, they stopped taking in women. They sold it in 1998 for $4 million to a private billionaire. And today it is just a private home worth 6 to 8 million. I can't remember. But anyway, you can look it up on Zillow. Anyway, and it's in the neighborhood.
Well, another tenuous connection is that in the 70s and early 80s, we went there for Christmas.
Right. And I actually have that another one. Yes. So. And it is, so, yeah, I went over the top. Then I found this article that said there's an EADS group. What? So the EADS group gives out grants for homeless. So they gave the address. So yes, it's so creepy. I went there, and there it is. That's my photograph. And I wrote a letter to 8008 Ridge Road. That's off River Road. And said, hi, I'm from Dumbarton. We're trying to find out more about Margaret Eads. So stay tuned. It hasn't come back yet, but I'm trying to figure out what's happened. It was pretty scandalous what happened, how the board sold her house to private investors. And then that's a chunk of change that they've been given out. But a tiny bit. They were supposedly going to send other people there, but no, it went into the private Eads board, Eads Home Society. Yes, you would have thought it would have gone to the Methodist home, which was needing money. Yes, there was a lot of protests. Most of the articles, if you find Margaret Eads, are about the legal troubles. And Joan, you would love this. The two women who went to court, 2 trials and an appeal, whether they actually had standing as widows or residents of Georgetown. Yeah, that's a lot of money just in court. So anyway, $75,000 of court cases to defend the women who actually eventually died. There's the Women's Mite Society. There was a Sunday school teachers training class. So now, one of the things, of course, in Methodism that's very important is our classes and our Sunday schools. So at the very beginning, it's all men. Men are running the classes, men are running the Sunday schools. So it's not until we get the teachers training classes started up where we have women starting to go through the teachers training classes. They're raising money for charity as well. And I fell in love with my other favorite woman. So aren't we cute there? Look at that. That's our ancestors there. You may see some of those names. So the UMW also has this fabulous,
You were one of the
fabulous videos that explains how the WCTU and the
You
missionaries
were one of the 24 women
became
on that
the
fabled
UMW.
committee, that committee of 24.
So this is
that was
another
tasked with
hour-long
creating
video.
One organization out of the former women's.
So the woman
mission
on the right is
organizations.
giving an oral
They had the
history.
important work of forming one organization going on into the future. And the committee, of course, as you remember, was comprised of 8 women from the former Wesleyan Service Guild, which was the Methodist women's organization for employed women. 8 women came from the Women's Society of Christian Service, which was also a Methodist organization. And then there were 8 women who didn't belong to either organization. The decision to actually combine the two women's mission organizations had come after a few years of the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren Church uniting to become the United Methodist Church. So you all on this committee of 24 came from different areas of the country. So I would guess there were probably differences in thought because of the two previous organizations. Was it difficult to work with complete strangers? How did you all form a sense of community to get this work done?
I would have to say it was a little difficult at first because we really hadn't known each other. We did come at it from different ways. I never had been a part of the Wesleyan Service Guild, but of the what we call WSCS. I guess really when we got down to it, there were differences, but the thing that probably held us together was after we started working on the purpose.
So anyway, so the purpose, again, we begin with the UMW. I didn't go into much of the UMW. Many of us here in the room tried to get the UMW back together again, and we were just kind of busy. So I would like to be able to say, I know who Anna C. Reed is. So I'm looking at the time and I'm looking at how many slides I have left, but I'm going to throw this out. I don't think this is the right Anna C. Reed. Department of Labor discusses the need of young workers, but this is the top of our communion steward. It covers, Carl, can you go look to see if it's still in the kitchen? It's kind of important for my scavenger hunt. So here we have Anna C. Reed. Anybody know anything about her? I mean, we've got dead people's names all over this church, and I'm still trying to figure them out. It's like walking through a cemetery here. So Anna C. Reed, communion steward, who are you? Where are you? So I'm still looking for information on her. And I thought this was hilarious. We're having our homecoming on October 16th, 2022. And there's October 17th, 1942. And I put this in because of the last line. This is what you see throughout all of them. Trustees' notes. A supper served by the church ladies is set for 6 p.m. Or thank you to the ladies, or we'll have to ask the ladies for a covered supper, or the ladies served a wonderful covered supper. So again, this is from the Washington Post, 1942. I asked Jane Donovan, whose husband, Graham Donovan, had a stroke, a mini stroke about 3 weeks ago by now. So she said, I'm a little busy. I asked her who her woman of Dumbarton was, and she said Minnie Birch, who was our organist for 40 years. Her name's not up there as Minnie Birch, it's Mrs. Isaac Birch. She lived across the street, and her name is sprinkled throughout the newspapers of DC as the organist. This is for you, church choir members. Here is a 10-day retreat to Colonial Beach. I'm not sure what was going on for 10 days at Colonial Beach, but that seems like a pretty crazy church retreat. And then here's a list of all of the choir members. There's a whole box about Dumbarton church members. Basses and tenors were listed on one page, sopranos and altos on another page. Yeah, well, no, it's segregated by men. And then 3 pages later, it's women. All right, here's the woman I love, Miss Irene Umberger. I read through all the trustees' notes, but they called them minutes of the official board. Men said this, men said this. All of a sudden, my eyes went, what? Oh, woman, Miss Frances Umberger. And you read the notes, and Frances, only woman there, 1930, 10 men there. Apparently, she worked for the government in an office, so she had money. But every time she got up to ask something, they said no. So she asked if they would do this, and they said no. However, she was given money to the church too, so they kept her on the board of trustees and then again, she asked, could Miss Turkington practice on the organ? No, our organ's kind of special. Anyway, she hung in there. I talked to Mary Kay this week, and she said one of the movements they have at their church I hadn't heard about is the Deaconess and Home Missioners. So we had deaconesses, 1910, they were like nuns. They lived at the Lucy Webb Hayes Training School, which is now the nursing home. So they were single women dressed in black, and they would come and work at the church. So we had a few. We had missionaries. This is from Many Witnesses. Barbara Brown Bradley and her husband Hank. They translated the Bible into Mixtec. So they weren't an official missioner, but thank God Mitty has been introducing us to the Hoovers. I don't know who the Hoovers really are, but I got a chance to talk with Ellen and Jeff, and they were our line item missionaries, and they're charming people. This is Dr. Ellen Hoover, who's been teaching at the university with her husband. And then I found this little notice when I started just looking at who Dr. Ellen Hoover is. She has a UMW circle named after her in Beltsville, Maryland, the Dr. Ellen Hoover Circle. And I thought, I know they're retired, but from 2017, but I wish that we'd done a little bit better in honoring the Hoovers when they were here. You know, here she is, our woman missionary. We don't have a UMW circle to raise money for them, but I always thought they were just nice people that came to visit. And now I realize again, after looking at them, how amazing the Hoovers are. Now, Mary Krause was not our first pastor, a first woman pastor, nor will she be our last, but of course she was the pastor when I came. Now we're getting into people who are still alive and kicking. And this is where I'm going to turn it over to y'all. I have a spreadsheet. I want you to do it yourself biography. Go to the spreadsheet. I'll send the link out again and again and again. Women, I'm talking to you. Men, you can tag along if you want. But if nobody writes our history, no one will. So write your own biography. It's not hubris to get out there and write who you are. As I said, don't wait for it to be an obituary that gets put in there. That's awkward. Sometimes I can't find them. So go ahead, write about yourself, and we will have a her story that we approve and that will mean something to coming generations. Because let me tell you, I've spent hours digging out names. And for God's sake, who is Anna Reed? I'm still trying to find you, Anna Reed. So on that note, yes, there's more. There's the United Methodist Women. We could look at the Book of Discipline and say, what does it say? But it says we're all equal. And then let's get to making this something that we'll be proud of for the next 250 years. And at that, it is 10:46. Any comments or questions?